I want to begin by saying welcome to my Defense Committee members, Dr. McCall, Dr. Sangoras, Dr. Wurst, and Dr. Creech. I appreciate the expertise you bring to viewing this presentation, and I extend welcome to anyone else who spends time here as well. My name is Eva Bleeker, and this presentation describes my dissertation written for the Doctorate of Education program at Baylor University. This is a study about narrative. It's called Chaplains and Narrative Identity, a convergent triangulation study with clinical pastoral education interns. Going forward, I will refer to that as CPE. And I will share the story of this study's development, the story of its implementation and findings, and what the next chapter may be. So, once upon a time, I discovered a problem. Although vocational chaplaincy requires awareness of personal stories, no known studies have evaluated awareness of narrative identity in chaplaincy students. You see, this problem exists in a narrative-dependent context. There is a well-established relationship between clinical chaplaincy and stories. Any provision of healthcare, including spiritual care, is predicated on the exchange of narrative between the clinician and the patient. And there is some research about narrativity in hospital chaplaincy in the literary corpus. The most poignant research gap I found corresponds to the story the chaplain is telling herself during the adaptive phase of CPE. This internalized personal story is called narrative identity. I may have set a record for the level of joy experienced by a doctoral student while I was conducting this literature review. It was just fascinating for me. So I argued that 20th century philosopher Paul Ricoeur's concept of narrative identity, the idea that life is a quest for narrative, has influenced 4 disciplines that converge in CPE training. So with Ricoeur's narrative identity as the starting point, we move into its influence in pastoral care, clinical medicine, transformative learning theory, and psychology. And then these 4 disciplines converge in the andragogy and the clinical context of CPE training. I really felt like I uncovered the story of CPE, and discovering these connections strengthened my understanding of what I'm doing when I'm training chaplains. Also, narrative identity's strong presence in the psychological sciences supplied the theoretical framework I used to support this study. So that's narrative identity theory, or NIT, and I wanted to visualize that here as well. This is a very tight synthesis of the study's purpose. This study evaluated awareness of narrative identity in chaplaincy students to discover what results might emerge after a unit of CPE, meaning I intended to use the andragogy and experience of CPE as a treatment with participants and measure how that treatment affects narrative identity. And you will see my mixed methods approach represented in 3 research questions. First, I asked a quantitative question. What is the effect of participation in a unit of CPE on participants' awareness of narrative identity questionnaire scores? This was complemented by a qualitative question. How do chaplaincy students narrate their experiences in response to an interview protocol developed in parallel with the Awareness of Narrative Identity questionnaire, henceforth to be known as the ANIQ? My integrated question asks, what results related to narrative identity emerge from comparing quantitative and qualitative data collected from chaplaincy students during a unit of CPE? And I have the integrated research question at the top of this slide because it rests, so to speak, on the theoretical framework. As I mentioned before, I utilized NIT, which was pioneered by Dan McAdams, as the theoretical framework for this study. And I want to say two important things about it. First, McAdams has this beautiful way of conceptualizing NIT. He describes it as an integrative psychological construct, a bridge between the sciences and the humanities. So this integrative theory fit well with an integrative research methodology. And the second big thing is that because NIT is well established as a theory in psychological research, I had access to psychometrically sound assessment tools to collect empirical data on awareness of narrative identity. My background in chaplaincy and narrative medicine and higher ed made me truly curious about the answers to these research questions, and I chose a mixed methods design for several reasons. First, it's a narrative-oriented study, so I needed to include narration from my participants, their voices. I needed a qualitative strand of data. I also really wanted to include statistical data for my own learning, and because medical contexts historically have honored quantitative data above any other kind. But as I reviewed the literature about the current state of medical research, I learned that mixed methods is being referred to as a quiet revolution in medical research. It is gaining credibility. So I settled on a convergent triangulation mixed methods study. So in the quantitative phase of this study, I used the ANIQ as a pre-test and post-test. This is a 20-item questionnaire that measures 4 subscales of narrative awareness. The scores are collected by subscale and analyzed by subscale. For the qualitative phase, I wrote an interview protocol modeled on something called the life story interview that was developed by Dan McAdams and his team at Northwestern University, but I modified their protocol to parallel the 4 domains of the ANIQ, and I conducted those interviews during the final month of the CPE unit. And after analyzing the data from these 2 phases independently, I merged them for integrated analysis. Participants eligible for this study were CPE interns enrolled at Denver Seminary, where I teach, during the semester in which I collected data. I had 10 eligible participants, and all 10 self-selected into the study. Let's talk about the findings. The results for the quantitative phase of this study lacked statistical significance for all 4 subscales. I had hypothesized that the post-test scores would increase, meaning that I expected that awareness of narrative identity would increase after this semester-long unit of CPE. And it is true that 3 median subscales did increase, just not in a statistically significant way. 1 median score decreased, and of course that is important too. So this is a very small sample. It is nowhere near generalizable. And while 3 subscale scores did increase, they were not statistically significant, and I had to retain the null hypothesis for the quantitative phase of this study. My analysis of the qualitative data set revealed that participants' testimony about their experience of CPE did align with growth in narrative identity in 3 out of the 4 ANIQ subscales, and participants demonstrated their growth by describing experiences and narrating vignettes that fell under the definition of the ANIQ subscales. These definitions come from the theoretical framework, NIT, and I used framework analysis for the qualitative phase of the study. So, integrating this data told a story of conflicting results and a story of harmonious results. So here's the central conflict that emerged from the integration phase. While none of the subscale analyses yielded quantitatively significant results. Qualitative analysis pointed toward increased awareness of narrative identity in 3 out of 4 ANIQ subscales. And then simultaneously, the data told a harmonious story. Participants reported quantitative and qualitative growth for the same 3 subscales. And furthermore, there was only one subscale for which all 10 participants narrated experiences of growth, and that same subscale yielded the greatest quantitative increase in median score. So there's conflict in these integrated results, and there's harmony. Well, good stories contain conflict, so perhaps this study is telling us a good story. Researchers who find conflict between quantitative and qualitative results during mixed methods analysis need to situate their approach to analysis between something called non-complementary on one hand and complementary interpretation on the other hand. So I chose to retain all my data. That is the complementary approach. You see, if researchers expel an entire data set of results by choosing a non-complementary approach, critical insights may disappear with that data. So there needs to be a really good reason to jettison a data set, like a breakdown in the data collection process, for example. So I chose to retain all my data. I felt like that honored the participants, and I needed to get comfortable with conflict. There are 4 groups connected to the implications of this study. The first is the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. Narrative identity aligns with the components of CPE curriculum, but not all chaplaincy educators have training in narrative philosophy or methodology. So educators could utilize the theoretical frameworks of NIT in their classrooms. The Association of Professional Chaplains holds an interest in the findings of this study as well. These are the story catchers. Members of this group have completed at least 4 CPE units, and they often mentor CPE interns. And in order to maintain their professional credential, board-certified chaplains must participate in research annually. So healthcare chaplains could contribute to the body of NIT scholarship through future iterations of this study while simultaneously maintaining their certification. The third group is comprised of narrative medicine practitioners and scholars. Cross-disciplinary alliances between chaplains and medical providers represent locations of potential research partnerships. So in future studies, I hope to recruit co-investigators, especially physicians, nurses, and psychologists, to promote collaboration and diversify the knowledge base for understanding NIT. And finally, administrators and faculty members at Denver Seminary represent a group of stakeholders. We could deepen our understanding of narrative identity for the benefit of students who will work in other forms of pastoral ministry. I have 3 avenues for distribution amongst my 4 groups of stakeholders. In recent years, the APC and the ACPE have combined for a joint conference. So here I will propose a conference paper that presents key findings, recommendations for andragogical strategies, and offers opportunities to co-author. The Narrative Medicine Exchange Alumnix Weekend is an academic conference held annually in June. And here I will propose a presentation that features the connection between the academic discipline of narrative medicine and the tenets of NIT. And at Denver Seminary, the administration and faculty come together 4 times a year in a forum meant to share research. So in this venue, I will report key findings and suggest strategies for implementing NIT in other academic programs. And I might share my hope to establish a Center for Spiritual Care research at our campus. In closing, I send out huge gratitude to my defense committee and to anyone else who made it to this point in my presentation. Thank you for spending time here and for supporting my dissertation defense.